I've been together with Mike for most of the day today, and it's been brilliant. So I'm sure he got a lot of good answers on your questions. There's still one thing it's not so good about him. I really like basketball, and Mike is from Atlanta, so I asked him if you were into basketball. Atlanta got a good team, but a team in the NBA, and Mike didn't even know whether they were good or bad. I was so disappointed. But unfortunately, besides that, it's been great being with, and he got answers on almost every question I've asked him. So feel free to ask him questions. I'll come around with the microphone to whoever has a question. Just raise your hand. You can come out with Mike. Okay, down in the back.
Hi, my name is Ivan. Thank you for your excellent talk. My question is concerning the 1 Corinthians 15, where you talked about there being, at most like 20 years is what you said, right? When you listen to a guy like William the Great, for example, he'll say something like at the most 5 years. And I think I've heard him say that Bart Ehrman is willing to go as far as 1 year close to the death of Jesus. So I was just curious why you are more conservative, or whatever you want to call it, in your estimation. That's my question.
Yeah, great question. Well, even James D.G. Dunn says we can be entirely confident that it had formed within 6 months. So my question to those scholars would be, how do you know that? Where do you get that from? Even skeptical scholars are willing to back that oral tradition up to, within a year or two of the crucifixion. But I want to know, how did they get that? So when I'm doing my research, I'm doing it I want to see what we can prove about the resurrection, but my primary interest is truth. Did he rise? What's the evidence? And if it can be used to prove the resurrection and show that Christianity is true, fantastic, but I'm primarily after truth. So as I'm looking through all this, I'm seeing all the scholars doing it. So if I were doing it just for merely apologetic purposes to defend the faith, I'd be saying, yeah, look, this is what all these scholars say here. We can get this within 6 months or 1 to 2 years. Even the guys at the Jesus Seminar, Ludeman, an atheist New Testament scholar. But I'm interested in truth. So when I'm looking at this, I say, okay, Paul's given it to them in 55, if not earlier. He says, I delivered to you, when I first set up the church, what I also received. So we know at least, at the very latest, it's sometime in 51, a month or so before he sets up the church there. We know that's the absolute latest date he could have received it. But when did he receive it? We don't know. And some say, well, those who like to back it up say, well, okay, like within the 1 to 2 years, they'll say, well, maybe Paul received it, 3 years after his conversion when he goes up to Jerusalem. So maybe this is, say, 5 years after the crucifixion, and that's already in play, it's probably within a year. Still, we don't know that. As far as we know the apostles were claiming Jesus rose and appeared to them, and he appeared to Peter, the 12, and all that. But the time that it got stylized into this oral tradition and passed along to Paul, we don't know. So I'm just trying to be honest with the data that we have and say, what can we prove? Well, we can prove he gets it, it can't be later than 51, and it's probably earlier, perhaps much earlier than that. And it certainly goes back to the eyewitnesses. So whether it was 20 years later or 2 months later, it's coming from the eyewitnesses. So that's what I go with. And when you look at the reasons, they usually don't give any reasons why they put it at those dates. They just say it. So when I see a skeptic give a date like that, it's like, well, that's cool that they acknowledge it. They know it's early, but they usually don't give any reason. So that's why I'm just being cautious and not going beyond what I think the evidence actually shows.
Anyone another? Just raise your hand.
What do you think is the best argument a non-Christian can come up with against the reliability of the resurrection of Jesus?
I think if I were not going to believe the resurrection, I think the best argument you could come up with would be there's just not enough evidence. It's just not enough. To say it's hallucination doesn't work. To say they lied or it was a myth, it doesn't work. To say, like John Dominic Crossan says, that it's just a metaphor, I think those things are easily refuted. To say these things don't happen today, I think that's irrelevant. I don't expect my grandfather or my mom or dad to be raised from the dead. They're just people. If Jesus was who he claimed to be, God's uniquely divine Son, I expect a resurrection. It shouldn't surprise me. So that it's different. So again, I think the best argument that would be given by non-believers is like, well, that's pretty interesting. I don't know what happened, but it's not enough to convince me. So I would think that's the best.
What would you answer, E2?
So if a skeptic raised that, I'd say, well, I can appreciate that. But what would it take to convince you? And then I'd want to know whether it's truly an objection. So sometimes I'll ask a person, look, if Jesus rose from the dead, would you become a Christian? If you knew for a fact he rose from the dead? I've asked that of 3 skeptics. I've asked it of more than 3 skeptics, but 3 skeptics who I've asked it to said no. So it's like, well, this is just a game then. Why am I even talking to you? If you wouldn't believe, if you wouldn't become a Christian, even if it could be proven beyond any doubt that Jesus rose from the dead, then why are we even talking about this? You can raise all these questions, but you're really not open to it. So, but if it's not an emotional objection like that, and they're really interested, I would just get a little more in depth with the conversation with them. Talk about the evidence some more. And of course, there's going to have to be a part that faith is involved, because no historian can get into a time machine, return to the past, and verify their conclusions. Like I said, we always wish we had more cards. We wish the cards we had were better, but we got to play the hand we've been dealt. So no matter what it is, and no matter what worldview one takes, even if they take an agnostic or atheist worldview, that takes faith too. Because they got to look at the evidence for the resurrection and say, no, I'm not going to believe. They got to look at the scientific evidence from astrophysics and molecular biology and say, well, yes, it really does appear that the universe was designed and that life was the product of design, but I'm going to choose to believe that it's a natural explanation, and that that's just all coincidence that it looks like design. It still takes faith, because again, none of us can get into the time machine and go back and verify our worldview. So no matter what we believe, it takes faith.
I'm passing. What's your take on the Gospel according to Mark chapter 16, where we have the women going to the grave, and it ends up with a total disaster? They flee from the grave with confusion and sorrow and so on. Do you take that as a... I mean, tonight we've mostly looked at Paul as a proper evidence, but what about that?
Well, it doesn't say out of confusion and sorrow. It said out of fear and trembling they fled, right? It said nothing to no one. And then it ends there. And I don't know how it is in your translations, but whether I'm reading the Greek New Testament or English translations, there's usually some brackets there around verses 9 through 20 and say that these do not appear in the best manuscripts were probably not in the original, and that's almost certainly true. So why does Mark end like that, with the women fleeing out of fear and trembling and saying nothing to no one? Does that mean that they don't know about the appearances, or that the appearances were invented later on? Well, first of all, Paul mentions the appearances in 1 Corinthians 15 before any of the Gospels were written. So it's not like Mark wouldn't have known of the appearances. Moreover, in chapter 14, verse 28, Jesus tells them, his disciples, that after he is raised from the dead, he will go ahead of them to Galilee and meet them there. And that's why in chapter 16, verse 7, the angel tells the women that he has been raised from the dead. Now go, tell the disciples of Peter that he's gone ahead of them to Galilee, and there they will see him just as he told you. So Mark knows that Jesus told them he's going to appear to them in Galilee. Mark knows that the angel tells the women that he's going ahead, and they're to go tell the male disciples to go to Galilee, there they will see him. And Mark knows about these appearances from the disciples, because Paul was saying it. And where does Paul get this tradition? From the disciples in Jerusalem, one of which is Peter, whom he had met with. And Mark was reporting what he remembered Peter telling him. So we have two questions here. Number one is, why did it say, out of fear and trembling, they said nothing to no one? And number two, why doesn't he mention the appearances? So the saying nothing to no one, that same grammar is used in chapter 1, verse 44, when Jesus heals a leper and says, now go show yourself to the high priest as Moses commanded, and show the priest, say nothing to no one, and go show yourself to the priest what the Lord has done. What it means is don't stop along the way and talk to anyone, go straight to the priest. And that's the same language that is used for the women. Out of fear and trembling, they said nothing to no one. So why does it stop there? Well, if they said nothing to no one, how does Mark know about it? I've just given you a number of reasons why he would have known about it. Jesus predicted it, the angel said it. Paul says this is what the disciples were saying. One of those disciples was Peter, and Mark is writing down what Peter said. Scholars have given a number of reasons why Mark does not have the appearances in his gospel. And the appearances are legion. It's like when there's 5 New Testament scholars opining on this, there are 7 reasons. Different reasons. One of the reasons is that the Mark, I forgot what scholar it was, but it's like this Gospel of Mark was being read. It was written to be delivered as an oral story, okay, to a storyteller, to be memorized and read. And then it's one of Jesus' disciples who is reading it, and then whoever's reading it fills in their own experience of when Jesus appeared to them. Possible. Or he's saying this too because they want to downplay the women and get them out of there. And it's like, let the people say, we're supposed to be the witnesses that Jesus rose from the dead. Because the women were disobedient. They said nothing to no one. Possible. Or, at that point, people in the audience are to share about their experience of seeing the risen Jesus. Possible. None of those can be proven. A number of scholars think that either Mark's ending has been lost or he was unable to complete it for some reason. And that's why it ends abruptly. That's kind of where I lean. It probably got lost or Mark was unable to end it. So that's where I'm at. But I don't think there is any reason to conclude like some skeptical scholars like to do and say, see, Mark didn't know of any of the appearances. And so he knows of an empty tomb, and it was a spiritual resurrection, and it's not till later where they have these appearances of this physically raised Jesus. Paul talks about a physically raised Jesus before, in 1 Corinthians, before Mark even writes his gospel. So You know, a number of those reasons, I just don't think those are good explanations. So, bottom line, we don't know why he doesn't mention the appearances, but he does seem to know about them, in my opinion.
Could we claim that it's kind of a bold way to choose to what's the word? Express your gospel? I mean, for Mark, so to start out with the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, or Son of Man. That's where he starts, and then he has the courage to end up with this kind of disaster, because the gospel as a whole has the force to withstand any doubts, or he actually has the courage, and he's convinced that his gospel as a whole is capable of convincing people about its truth, even though he doesn't end up with any eyewitness of Jesus as a raised, or Jesus risen from the dead.
So let me see if I'm getting understanding you on that. It's almost as though he wants to convince people about who Jesus is, and he tells the story of Jesus raising from the dead, but he doesn't mention the appearances because the readers aren't going to see an appearance, and there's an element of faith. I guess I'm not exactly following.
I'm not going to speak clearly enough, I guess. But well, to me, it's a very firm argument, I guess, that well, there's definitely an element of belief, but to me, it's really an argument or proof that the Gospels are not invented or, constructed to tell a lie, because how would you ever construct a lie like this and end up with this kind of disaster? The main character dies, and the people who followed him end up with confusion.
But if he rose from the dead, Mark reports he rose from the dead.
Yeah.
If he appeared, and the angel's telling the women that Jesus said he was going to appear to his disciples in Galilee, now go tell them to go up there, what would be the harm in narrating an appearance to the disciples in Galilee? How would that conflict with what you're saying Mark's objective is?
I'll think about that.
Hey, my name is Benedict. I have two questions. Would you agree with me that pride is the reason why mankind have hard time believing in the resurrection of Jesus Christ?
I missed one word you said. Would I agree that something is the reason why people...
Pride.
Pride.
Yeah. Sin.
Maybe in some cases, sure.
Yeah.
Because it would show Christianity's true and they don't want to submit to God. I suppose that is the case with some people, sure.
The second question is, somewhere Paul says that he wrote in his letters that if those he was writing to, if they do not believe in the resurrection, that their faith is in vain, and they were still in their former unbelief, and something like that. So you mentioned also earlier that the early church, the early apostles who died, they died because they believed that Christ really rose from the dead, and the resurrection was true, and that's why they died. But today we die because we die for our faith, those who have been killed, because they have not seen the resurrection, we do experience it in our lives. If you get what I'm saying.
I don't. I'm sorry.
James, Peter, and John, they died because of what they believed in.
Yeah.
Because they've seen Christ rose from the dead. But today, you said that we die because we believe that they said that Christ.
Right. They died for what they knew was either true or false. We're dying for what we believe is true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what I'm asking is, why can't we also die as if we have seen and witnessed the resurrection? Because we do witness the resurrection power in our own lives after believing in
Because we
Christ.
experience the resurrection in our own lives.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because when he said, I am the way, the truth, and the life, no one
Yeah.
comes to the Father except through me. I mean, when we receive him, we do experience the resurrection power in our own lives. I don't know about others, but I mean, to the one.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose technically speaking, we could say, you know, if you've seen miracles, and I think I've seen some miracles. I think I know some people who have experienced miracles, real miracles. I've got a friend, Craig Keener, who's written 2 volumes and he's documented within those many miracles that have happened even in modern times, even in his own lifetime with people he knows. His mother-in-law, for one, who lives over in the Congo. So, yeah, when someone sees something like that, they see miracles, and I mean, that can certainly bolster our faith and give us faith that Christianity is true. To have the power of the resurrection in our lives, I think, can also be evidence. We can see that through answered prayer, through the fruit of the Spirit, and things that God does through us. I just still wouldn't put that on the same. It's not the same as, like, you know, my mom died 5 years ago, my dad 4 years ago. If they were to walk through that door right now and come up here and say, that'd be pretty cool. I mean, that's in a different league, I think, of evidence than some of the other things that we experience, as impressive as they could be. So that would just be my opinion on that matter.
So, I was wondering, you mentioned that when Paul is citing the 1 Corinthians 15 creed, he's adding the words, some are still alive, or some have fallen asleep. I'm wondering, how do we know for a fact that the 500s were part of the original creedal material? Because if there really was 500 people, it would have been quite impressive, and that would be, to me at least, some quite strong evidence for the reliability of the resurrection. But how do we know that the 500, given the fact that they aren't mentioned in any of the Gospels, for instance, how do we know that Paul didn't just add that in his giving this creed in his letter? How do we know that this is part of the original creedal material?
Yeah. Well, I think the parenthetical statement that he puts in there, when he says most of whom are still alive but some have died, suggests that he's saying, you can check this out if you want. And why would you say that if you're making it up? Now, someone might come back and say, well, but he's writing this to the church at Corinth. That would have been too far from Jerusalem when this appearance would have probably occurred. But then I'd say, well, there certainly would have been merchants in that church that could have, probably gone to Jerusalem at some point. They could have checked it out. Plus this early oral tradition, he's saying, I delivered you what I also received. And this is what we preached, this is what you believed. So if they met, any of those people ever met another disciple, apostle who came by to preach to them, they could ask them and prove Paul a liar. And if this is an oral tradition that has been passed along to Paul, then it originates in Jerusalem. And even if people in Corinth couldn't have checked it out, people in Jerusalem could have. They would have known that. So it's also in all the manuscripts. There's no manuscript that would omit that particular appearance. I do think it's interesting that we find it in 1 Corinthians 15 in Paul's letters, but we don't find it in any of the Gospels. And the question is why? We don't know the answer to that. That doesn't really trouble me. Now, if it were in, say, John, the latest Gospel, but wasn't anywhere else, Paul or the other Gospels, that would be a different thing. Then someone would say, oh, that was made up, it's in the latest Gospel. It just happens to be in the earliest report of Jesus' resurrection. So the thing is, why didn't the others mention it? There's a possible few cases where it could be, like maybe it's the appearance of Jesus in Galilee to the disciples, where in Matthew 28:17 it says this, some worshipped him, but others doubted. I don't think that's the reason, because I've got a different explanation about the others doubted. I think it's, in my opinion, it's certain, so it wouldn't involve that. The appearance to Paul doesn't appear in the Gospels. The appearance to James doesn't appear in the Gospels. Why not to James? By the time it's 40 days and Pentecost comes along, they're in the upper room with Jesus' mother, sister, and brothers praying. So even though Jesus' brothers were not followers, probably all the way up to his crucifixion, they have become followers within 50 days after Passover. So how did that happen? And it seems to me the best explanation is what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15:7. Then he appeared to James. It was not narrated in the Gospels. But then you've got the appearance on the Sea of Galilee. It's only in John. You got the appearance to the Emmaus disciples. It's only in Luke. You got the appearance to Mary Magdalene at the tomb. Is only in Matthew, or is only in John. So they're each given different appearances, and it could be because they are providing the appearances that had been given them by eyewitnesses. It's just a guess. But the appearance to the 500, if you just look at that one, that's one. But then again, you got to look at the appearance on the Sea of Galilee, the appearance to James, the appearance to Mary Magdalene, the appearance to the Emmaus disciples. Each gospel is recording different ones. So I don't think they all have to report the same ones. I think there's some, yeah.
Hello, sir. My name is Dino. And you spoke about oral traditions, just like we have here an old, long history in the Nordic countries of oral traditions. We know, as a fact, that the victor always writes history, more or less.
Not always.
Not always.
Thucydides wrote one of the best histories in antiquity, the history of the Peloponnesian War, and he was on the losing side. Xenophon was on the losing side. Josephus was on the losing side.
More or less.
Yeah, so there are plenty of exceptions.
More or less, yeah, of course. How would you say that the oral traditions in the Christian tradition differentiates from the ones of the Nordic, where Saxo and many other scholars wrote of all the encounters with great warriors and great warlords and all of this after their death and long gone history? How would you say?
Great question. Great question. So we could talk maybe on a similar. I can't speak of the Nordic traditions because I don't know them. All right, so I speak blindly with this. I have no idea how reliable they are, or the value in being passed down, and what they thought about allowing legend. I know in the Hindu traditions, a Hindu scholar at Rutgers University told me that he translated the Bhagavad Gita for Penguin Classics too. So he's a respected Hindu scholar, and he said that the Hindus will pass along stories in the Hindu tradition, and even today they allow more legendary influence to continue to go with it, and that's okay with them. So, you could ask, well, in the Nordic traditions, was that okay for that? And did they allow some of these traditions to have the snowball effect and the stories grow for national pride, or the pride in an ethnicity. Did that happen? It certainly happened with Romulus, the legendary founder of Rome, where traditions came. In fact, by the time you get to Cicero in the 1st century BC, in one of his letters, he mentions about Romulus and the whole legend about him being a feral child, and Romulus and Remus being raised by a wolf and a woodpecker. That we shouldn't look too carefully at these stories, he says, for their historicity. And these things were like invented, and there was probably a historical Romulus, and he was probably killed when he, by the Senate and the other leaders when he was becoming a tyrant. And the story just grew over time and legend got in there. But it took a long time. When we're looking at the Christian accounts, the stuff about the resurrection that we're getting is within just a few decades. And it's rooted in eyewitness testimony. So the Nordic tradition, I don't know how long that story is from the originals. But with the Christian tradition, it's very close, and it's coming out where the eyewitnesses are still alive and can be traced back to them. One further thing I'll say, and then I'll let you follow up here. When we talk, there's T.M.D. Menninger, who is one of I think he's a Swedish scholar. He put out a monograph in 2001 called The Riddle of Resurrection. A very good scholar, a very careful scholar. And in the beginning, in the introduction of his book, he says that it is the consensus of scholars today that the Christians did not borrow the idea of dying and raising gods from pagan religions. He says, but he's going to take exception to that. He's good. Oh, and forgive me, let me correct that. He says it's the consensus of scholars that there were no traditions of dying and rising gods that predate Christianity. But he says he was going to take exception to that. And in this monograph, he sets out a case that there were at least 3 and perhaps as many as 5. In the end, he says none of these may apply, but he says all 5 of these are tied to the agricultural cycles. So the god dies, and therefore that's to explain the drought in the summer. And when he rises from the dead, that's to explain why the rain comes and there's growth and there's life to the crops. And it always involves figures who lived in the distant gray past for which there's no date involved. It's once upon a time this happened. He says, but with the Christians and resurrection, it's not tied to the agricultural cycles. It's like a fulfillment of prophecy. The eyewitnesses are saying it. The stories are circulating while the alleged eyewitnesses are still alive. And so in his appendix, when he says this, he says the Christians could not have borrowed from pagan myths. So where did they come up with resurrection? And he says the riddle remains. So anyway, go ahead. If you come back with another thought, I'd be happy to entertain it.
I will let you know.
Stop.
Hi. What are the evidence for the resurrection around the empty tomb, the guards who protected the grave, risking their lives? Is that a clear question? Do you have how do you...
So I would give, there's several evidences we could give for the empty tomb, okay? Like number one, I would point out that the story is that Jesus is buried in Jerusalem. I mean, we know he's crucified in Jerusalem. Tacitus and Josephus mention it. Bar Serapion and Lucian mention about Jesus. Lucian mentions Jesus being crucified in Palestine. And then you've got Tacitus saying he was crucified by Pontius Pilate, of course, who was the governor of Judea. Josephus says he was crucified by Pontius Pilate. So it's going to happen in Jerusalem. Jesus is given a burial in Jerusalem. So how is it, if he's buried, if they say he was raised from the dead and his body is still in a tomb or in a grave, how are they going to get away with that? You know, when that body could just be exposed. Now the Jews wouldn't go and try to expose it because they would have been ceremonially defiled. But certainly the Romans wouldn't have had such of those kind of sensitivities, and they couldn't have exposed the body. So it seems like it would have been impossible for Christianity to get off the ground in Jerusalem with the body if the location of Jesus' body was known, because they could have just exposed it, or anyone saying they went to the tomb, yep, we saw Jesus, even if they'd gone to the wrong tomb and they saw a body that even looked like Jesus's, of the same stature, you know, it would have caused some serious question about their claim. Also, you've got, like in Matthew's Gospel, when it says the disciples stole the body and guards fell asleep, then you've got Matthew saying, and that story is still circulated by the Jews even to this day. So his readers would have known this. It's like, well, why are the skeptics responding by saying the disciples stole the body? Well, that implies itself that the tomb was empty. If when I was in elementary school and I go into the class, because you guys call it lower school, and I go into class and I'm supposed to turn in my homework and I say the dog ate it, I don't, you know, that tells the teacher I don't have it. And when you say the disciples stole the body, that is to say it's not in the tomb. They're trying to provide an explanation for it. Later on you find Tertullian saying that people were saying the gardener stole or reburied the body because he was afraid that people coming to visit Jesus' tomb would trample over his lens patch. So that's why the tomb was empty. Or Celsus in the middle of the 2nd century says that Jesus faked his death. Again, that would be a reason to explain the empty tomb. Now in terms of the guards, could we say, well, the guards being there, they wouldn't have allowed someone to steal the body because that would have been their own necks on the, you know, on the block. I've heard that used many times. I don't buy that. Plutarch tells the story of Julius Caesar when he is he's kidnapped at one point. This is before he becomes big. This is when Caesar's young. And he gets kidnapped by some pirates. And then he's fleeing. I think it was from, who was he fleeing from? Sulla, I think it was. Sulla was a tyrant, the last dictator of Rome. Interesting enough, this just dawned on me. He was the last dictator of Rome until Julius Caesar. So he's after Caesar, and Caesar flees. And Sulla sends some troops out to get Caesar, and a centurion finds him. And Caesar bribes him to let him go. And they go, and he's free, and Sulla doesn't catch him. So the Gospel of Matthew says that the Jewish leaders bribed the soldiers to say that they fell asleep and the disciples stole the body. That sounds plausible to me, without them being killed. So I wouldn't use that as evidence to say, well, you know, they would have been killed. I've heard that, yeah, if they let someone come by, they'd be killed. Well, in most circumstances, yeah, but there are exceptions, and we know of them. Does that answer the question, or did I avoid it, or miss it? Okay.
Unfortunately, we don't have any more time. Thank you very much, Mike. Give him an applause. It's been great listening to you, Mike, and we are so lucky to have you again tomorrow at the Lutheran School of Theology, Menighedsfakultetet, where Mike will talk about how should we understand inerrancy in regards to the Bible in light of first century perspectives on true storytelling. So if any of you have time tomorrow at 10 o'clock, you're very welcome. I'm sure it's going to be interesting. Jeg skifter lige over i dansk her til resten. Kom endelig op og snak med mig eller med Kurt eller en af os andre fra CKA, hvis vi hører mere om CKA, og få en flyer, så I kan se noget af det arbejde, vi laver. Hvis nogen af jer har lyst til at støtte os økonomisk, så er det også muligt. Man kan blive støttemedlem, som det hedder, og støtte os med 500 kroner om året, så vi har en chance for at vide, hvor mange penge vi har til at lave arrangementer af alt det her, og til at have ansættelser, og til at sprede apologetik yderligere ud i Danmark. Så hvis nogen af jer synes, det er et vigtigt arbejde, vi laver, så det er en måde, I kan bære med på det. Det er en måde, I kan gøre, at vi kan nå endnu bredere ud med det her arbejde, vi synes er vigtigt, og prøve i endnu højere grad at blande os i den offentlige debat, og i endnu højere grad lave en masse foredrag. Ellers er aftenen ved at nå sin ende. Jeg har lyst til lige at slutte af med en bøn, og så er det muligt bare at blive her, og eventuelt stille nogle spørgsmål til mig bagefter, eller snakke med hinanden. Kære Jesus, tak, at vi kan være sammen her og lytte til Mike, og lytte til hans undervisning om opstandelsen. Tak fordi, at vi faktisk med god, med rationel grund også kan tro på opstandelsen. Jesus, tak fordi at du blev menneske og gik i døden for os på den måde. Og jeg beder dig om, at den lyst, der er blevet vækket i nogle af os til at undersøge det her endnu dybere, at vi må følge den, og at vi må blive ved med at dykke længere ned i, hvem du er og din sandhed er. Amen. Tak for i aften. Kom endelig og bliv fattig, og så snak